Welcome to SP24. This is a session on enterprise search with SharePoint. It's titled The Search Immaturity Cycle and How to Create a Search Strategy. I'm Jeff Fried, and I'm delighted to be giving this talk. It's really cool to be serving an audience that's around the world and around the clock. Now, this talk is a bit of a change of pace for me. Usually, I'm working on, writing about, speaking about the technical aspects of search in SharePoint. Sometimes this is the architecture, the capabilities, or the underlying algorithms involved in search. Sometimes it's the deployment, installation, configuration, sizing, scaling, performance aspects. And often it's the applications of search, the development techniques, and the tools to create remarkable search-driven applications. But today I'm taking a more strategic angle. I aim to teach you some essential things about approach and strategy that will help you and your organization succeed with search. Let me introduce myself. I've been working with human language technology for 20 years now, with enterprise search for 14 years, and with SharePoint for 8 of those years. I've been involved with hundreds of projects with SharePoint and enterprise search through working at Fast Search, then at Microsoft, and now at BA Insight, which is a Microsoft partner focused on search. I've co-authored 4 books on developing with SharePoint, Microsoft Enterprise Search, and development of search-driven applications with SharePoint. And I still love it. As I mentioned, I'm usually speaking about the technical aspects of search. But something's been bothering me. It's been bothering me for quite a while, and it inspired me to give this talk to help people develop a successful search strategy. When it's implemented well, enterprise search can be wonderful, and there's many great capabilities in SharePoint 2013 for search. In fact, SharePoint now has one of the most powerful search engines on the planet built right into it. The capabilities are pretty remarkable, and they're used throughout SharePoint 2013. But what made me do this talk in particular is a paradox that I run into constantly. Search technology is amazing, and it's constantly improving. SharePoint is very capable, yet the vast majority of search projects still fail. Enterprise search is essentially broken at way too many organizations I talk to. General sense of users at most of these organizations is that people can't find anything. Here's a little animation illustrating how many people feel about enterprise search, even when they have the most sophisticated, powerful technology in their hands.
At my company, every time we use search, we get so overwhelmed we can't find what we're looking for. It's hard to stay on top of it all.
Well, that's kind of funny, but it's also kind of sad, especially for someone like me that's passionate about helping people be successful with search. And that's what I aim to do in this session. I hope that when you finish this session, you have a perspective and a set of approaches you can apply directly in your organization to be successful at these kinds of projects. And we're going to cover, first, what goes wrong, the pitfalls, traps, and this syndrome I call the search immaturity cycle, how you can avoid it. With that in mind, we'll then talk about a search strategy. What does it look like? How can you build one and develop it for your own organization, and the key ingredients of a search strategy? All right, let's get into it. I mentioned that way too many search projects end up being failures. And there's a pattern that I see repeating over and over. First of all, an organization decides to choose a new search engine and deploy it. They go out and either adopt Google, use the search that's built into SharePoint, use open source, or use autonomy, almost independent of what it is, the next step is to deploy it, only to discover that it's not as effective as they hoped, and people aren't able to find things. After a little bit of work, they determine that the problem must be that the content is not indexed, because if it's not indexed, you can't find it. And the next phase is to try to index all of the content, which takes a fair amount of work as well as footprint, and turns out to not work. Tends to bring in more irrelevant material and often makes the search results worse. Nevertheless, people do this time and time again. And when it doesn't work, the next step is to determine that maybe they missed something about what the user requirements are. And they implement a feedback mechanism, which is a good idea, but at this point it's perhaps a bit late. And they do questionnaires, surveys, put in feedback on the search application or search center, and users are still complaining they can't find anything. So what's the next step? The next step is to realize that metadata matters and that the content they have doesn't have good metadata. So let's ask users to tag everything, which rarely happens because it's a ton of work. The net result is continued frustration, and after some root cause analysis determines the problem must be the technology. And that starts the cycle over and over again. I call this the search immaturity cycle. And I've seen this at many, many organizations. I surveyed about 500 organizations last year, and 48% of them had multiple search engines from multiple iterations through this cycle. The average cycle time is about 3 years, and lots of organizations have been through it 3, 4, even 5 times. Over 70% of organizations have had this kind of failure at least once. And the current results aren't that encouraging. Only 12% of organizations said it was easy to find things. So this is a pretty dismal state of affairs in the industry. And it is not fundamentally a technology problem. It's approach, practices, and understanding. Search is usually heavily underestimated. I think it's because it's so simple on the outside and so familiar to us. We all use search in the consumer arena dozens of times a day. So it's very familiar, but because it's so simple on the outside and incredibly complicated under the covers, people underestimate it and don't know how to apply it well. And because it's a system that involves lots of people, it's a complex picture, and underestimating it is one of the traps. When it's done well, search can be great. And I've been in lots of organizations where we were able to stop this cycle, implement a successful search-driven application, followed often by another and another on the same platform, each of which is highly valuable to the business, providing productivity, insight, even a transformative effect on a business process or the whole business. I've seen lots of remarkable user experiences delivered on unstructured content using this technology, and a pattern of platforms that are very agile and flexible. And SharePoint is a perfect platform for this kind of use because it is so flexible as a development platform as well as being accessible as an administrative platform. So there's hope. Despite the search immaturity cycle, you can have great results. We set out at BA Insight to figure out what differentiates success in these kind of projects from failure, both applying direct research, working with analysts and industry consortiums, and collecting things from over 700 different companies that have been involved with search and search projects. And at a high level, our findings are these following traits. The organizations that succeeded in fielding effective search and avoided this search immaturity cycle treated information as a business asset, as opposed to those organizations that stayed stuck in the search maturity cycle, which tended to think of data and information as a burden. The organizations that succeeded used that information and looked at it as a competitive advantage and understood search as an enabling technology They understood from that that the value of the information was in the context of whatever the end user groups were trying to accomplish at that moment. And they understood that they needed an information strategy and a search strategy. Whereas those organizations that tended to fail looked at search as a tool or a utility that they could plug in, stand up, and walk away from. And they'd rarely seen a successful search project, especially in the enterprise. And this tended to create bad choices through a lack of understanding and underestimation of search and a set of preconceptions that are really traps. Probably the most predominant one is the tendency to try to build your own company's Google. Because Google is the ubiquitous form of search. We're all familiar with it. We all see it and use it every day. Yet, it's a trap to try to build this for your own organization. Why? Because search is not Google. Google is a specific implementation of search technology. You can learn from what Google has done, but it has to be applied within your organization. First of all, Google optimizes specifically for relevancy in a consumer environment and has built a very large revenue stream off of advertising driven by search technology. So they have a very specific business goal and business case that allows them to stay focused and also allows them to fund a remarkable investment in maintaining relevancy and grooming content. There's over 3,000 engineers at Google doing nothing but tweaking relevancy. And I'm not talking about those folks that are developing algorithms or improving the underlying search technology. This is watching how the search results trend over time and tweaking knobs. The content is also highly tagged. It's structured with good metadata, and there's an entire industry aimed at search engine optimization. So there's a big incentive for content creators to be found, and as a result, they tend to create good metadata on the content that enhances findability. Google is also very targeted. There's a conception that Google indexes everything, but in fact, out of about 1 trillion pages on the internet, Google indexes only 56 billion. So it's still quite a lot, but it's only a fraction of the available content. They focus on authoritative content, and that's a very good technique to apply in your own organization as well. There's lots of successful patterns among my current customers, in fact, and they are not trying to emulate Google or applying a let's just get Google here mentality. So this trap is easy to fall into, especially when you're frustrated, but it's something to be resisted. And applying the lessons of a lot of these companies is something that you can do to make successful search in your organization. So that's the first trap, trying to build your own company, Google. The second trap is to stand up one place to go for everything. Again, it seems intuitive. You're frustrated that there's a dozen different places to go to, and it's all about finding information. So it seems natural to have one search center for everything. That's also a trap. It tends to end up with a generic solution that's not good for anything. And in most intranets, tends to be optimized for HR style queries, which are the most frequent queries on an intranet. What's the lunch menu? Where's the 401k benefits, etc. Not for business processes that depend upon information. And if you look in the consumer domain, we're used to using lots of different applications or apps that are targeted, that are special purpose. If I'm looking to book a dinner reservation, I tend to use OpenTable because that's all they do, or TripAdvisor specifically for booking trips. There's online shopping for different kinds of product, and on and on and on. So the pattern that we see successfully used in our consumer lives is not a general purpose search, but quite a number of specific implementations of search technology to surface all kinds of unstructured content. That's really the lesson. Tailored and targeted search-driven applications are effective. They're effective in the consumer domain, and they're very effective in the enterprise domain. So the trap of saying I want one search to rule them all, my precious, leads you to something that's ineffective. Whereas the pattern of identifying those specific applications that can benefit from and need this technology and implementing something tailored for that audience is a very successful pattern. The third trap is to stand up out of the box search and walk away. With many enterprise technologies, you can do this. You can conduct a program, do a project. When you're done, you're done. And then perhaps come back annually and look at some kind of refresh. But search doesn't work that way. It is really quite organic. Content changes all the time, and you want that new content to be available. The most relevant content depends upon context, and that can change and drift. Even vocabulary drifts within almost every organization. So what people are looking for, how they ask for it, and what's most important to them to find are all changing. So if you stand up even a great implementation and then walk away and don't tend it, it tends to degrade. The lesson of the practice is what I call gardening. Having someone whose job it is to tend to the content and to tend to findability is an essential element of success. As you'll see, this doesn't have to be a full-time job, but it does have to be an identified job and recognized as being important. Okay, we've talked about 3 traps that I see people fall into very frequently as they are in this search and maturity cycle. Let's take a number of lessons out of the folks that are successful. The first, I've already mentioned, looking at information as an asset is a really important step. We only do 3 things with information. We create it, we author it, we manage it and store it, and we find it and reuse it. And knowing what you know is incredibly powerful and a significant competitive advantage in almost every industry. The energy industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry are increasingly discovering that they're actually information industries. And therefore, being able to get at important information and looking at it as a competitive advantage is really key. You'll see how this comes across in terms of creating a search strategy, because what derives from it is that having an information strategy is really important. Sometimes this is called information architecture, but it actually goes broader than that. It covers governance, intelligence, often now called knowledge management, security and access control. And looking at this holistically is often difficult, but if you don't look at it as a strategy, you will find yourself in this immaturity cycle because you can't see where you are, you can't make regular progress. So that lesson is important, and search is core to that strategy, both because any organization has multiple sources of content, and they're all moving, as I mentioned, organically at all times. So anything that can stitch and bridge between that information and make it findable is an essential element. That's really why search has become an underlying layer that's throughout SharePoint. But in that strategy, search is an enabling technology. It's not an application by itself. It's a technology that's used to field quite a variety of applications that meet different business requirements. And the fourth lesson has to do with resourcing. These relate to each other. If you underestimate search, and you don't view information and information access as strategic to your company, you'll tend to under-resource it. And if you do view them as strategic and you look at specific targeted business applications, you'll discover that you have plenty of value to make a strong business case for investment in search and in SharePoint. And then you have the means to resource search appropriately. At a high level, the recipe for success, if you take the traits that we discovered from our research across successful organizations versus those that failed with search, a search strategy as part of an information strategy is really an essential element. And the aspects of that include context, content, metadata, and user experience are part of the recipe. So we've now covered the search and maturity cycle and some traps that people fall into, ways you can avoid them, some lessons, and a recipe for success. The next part of this session is about developing a search strategy. And this is a key ingredient to succeeding in search. As you recall, we found across hundreds of different organizations that appreciating the value of your content and having a search strategy went hand in hand as a key trait in successful approach to deploying search. One essential thing to keep in mind, just a perspective, is that search is much broader than the technology. It does include the search engine technology that people very often focus on because it's so concrete, but everything that surrounds it is part of the system. The way that people create content, the way they publish it, including their tools and their organizational incentives, the indexing approach and the use of metadata, the user experience and the interface, both design and user experience approach matter a lot. And then, of course, the end users have a variety of goals, different psychology and behavior, and all of this is something that you need to account for and think about in your search strategy. Unfortunately, even the basic practices that go along with this are being neglected way too often. A recent survey done by Jane McConnell showed that only 12% of organizations have a search strategy in place. And half of those didn't include the business owners in their search strategy. So the psychology and goals and behavior of both the content creators and the end users wasn't consulted. Users were consulted about search requirements only about 1 in 10 times, and only slightly more frequently did people conduct usability tests. The vast majority of organizations have less than one full-time employee working on search, which, as I described earlier, is a very organic technology and systems. And perhaps as a result, less than a third looked at their search logs. These are pretty basic practices that are being neglected very, very often. And one of the core reasons for this is, I think, the lack of understanding about the potential and power of search and the lack of appreciation of the value of the content and the need for a search strategy. So if you start on the left here and you get it right, a lot of these practices will fall into place because you'll have both a strategy and a mandate to do search well. There is plenty of business value to be gained. Search addresses a problem of data silos, data explosion, and content reuse, as well as poor data quality. You can see that the business problems that people report in all of those areas have increased remarkably year on year. And as the volume of content goes up and data-driven decisions are more and more frequent, this problem only gets worse. That makes search very strategic for any information-driven organization. As you develop a search strategy, it's really important to start with the strategy. And we call this the SPOT methodology. Starting with strategy, considering the people in the system, the business objectives, and then coming to a technology leads to success. Too often, we start upside down with a sort of tops approach where you have a technology or you choose a technology and things follow from that. Watch out for that. And simply by attending this session, I think you've gotten awareness of the need for doing that. When you get into discovering the business value, you don't need to go through a super deep analysis to discover some key drivers in every organization. This is an example where there were 4 near-term business objectives that this company wanted to achieve that they could directly connect with the use of their unstructured information and with search technology to serve that up. Now, search strategies come in lots of different flavors and colors. Some of them are really this type of deployment or use approach. You may say, I only really want to work with small departments or functional groups and let them be islands, but make sure they're more functional within those islands. Or starting with a universal and intranet first in order to have the most people using it. Or really my favorite is to take a focused search approach and find a series of business needs that you can solve through search-driven applications and do those first, evolving then to something which is universal search and search used as a platform. Search as a platform is a pattern that I see regularly, and I would say it's now part of the strategy at over half of my current customers. The idea being that you can use one search technology, often one instance, but at minimum the same training tools and technology to serve both customer-facing applications and enterprising-facing applications, as well as services that other applications use, and do that across all the relevant content. Another useful strategy, especially if you're a large organization with lots of diverse stakeholders, is to build up a practice, some call this a search center of excellence, that can provide a service to the rest of the organization from IT. And there's a phenomenon here that I call the threshold of trust, that if you provide strong service and search as a product to a number of specific business applications and do that well, you find a positive effect where you reach a threshold of trust and you can replicate that pattern to lots and lots and lots of different groups. One of our customers has over 300 different search-driven applications. Another has implemented a self-service search vertical so that you specify a few things and the rest is automated. So this is a great pattern that you might incorporate into your strategy. It's pretty typical to approach search from a technology standpoint, as we described before. But even if you're using a spot methodology, when you get to the technology, you have to watch out for the tendency to work on key capabilities, what I call sub-strategies, independently. It's certainly simpler to look at all the content that you have, index it, then determine what the metadata looks like, and then look at the search UI. Unfortunately, that nearly always fails, and it's because these elements are interdependent. The user experience in search is completely data-driven. So the content is required to light up the user experience, and the kind of content that you have will change the design decisions that you make about what the user experience should be. Same thing with metadata. So the best approach is really a cyclical, almost agile approach where you get the appropriate content for one application, learn about it, and consider its metadata and the best way to interact with it holistically, and then come back in the cycle to the next step and the next step. And that's, in a nutshell, the idea of what I call our search strategy success model. Because all search projects require these four elements. You need to consider the context of the user or users or groups of users, the content, both what it is, where it is, what is important about it, and how do you get at it in a secure manner, the metadata, what's there and what you can create, and the user experience where it all lights up. Now, this model is conceptually pretty simple. And keeping those four things in mind, the content, metadata, and user experience, goes a long way. But it really is a challenging thing because of the dependencies I described. These things are interdependent, and as you develop sub-strategies for each of them, you'll be thinking about the others as well. Let's walk through them, starting with the context. Context is a simple word. What that means in the search world is that different people and different groups have different goals. Those goals, the task at hand, and the psychology of not just the person, but if you will, the audience, matters. And using this context to provide a strong search experience is really, really important technique and a really important mentality. This is why the one search to rule them all doesn't work, because these groups and these people are different and have different needs. For example, in a financial services arena, this is a customer that was doing wealth management. Not only did they have different context than investment bankers in the same firm or than the IT group in that firm, but the context depended upon the current market conditions. When a increased risk in real estate portfolios came up that was identifiable with specific content and specific keyword synonyms, terminology, as well as specific geographies. Building that context into the plan meant that this firm had a system that changed the relevance and adapted to these market conditions so could quickly identify customers that were at risk, find out all the information about them and about the market conditions, and get back to them quickly. And this was a very big success. It's technologically not complex to accomplish, but you have to have this as an element in your strategy by considering the context. Another element of this context, even within one audience, one group, department, function, is that different users have different psychology. One way to look at this is this 2x2 expert novice classification, where you may be new to a domain and an expert searcher. For example, researchers, librarians run this all the time, and you're trying to see what's out there and use exploration to learn about the domain, as opposed to being an expert in the domain when you're looking for outliers and new information or known information discovery. That psychology tends to use refinement instead of as an exploration technique. They use it as a quick locator. People that are really skilled in search in the enterprise tend to do different things. This is why you often have an advanced search that's separate. Find people, especially in research contexts, that make very sophisticated questions, and you get different results and really different system approach and user experience if you consider that. It'd be nice to pick only one of these and field the system for that class of user, just like it'd be nice to look at only one of the audiences, but it never happens that way in the real world. You have elements of all of these in your user population, and therefore the context is important. You can know by who it is and by their behavior what quadrant somebody is in, and use that context in the search experience as well. There's much, much more that I could go through about context and context strategy for search, but I'm just giving you a taste. The highlights, we've talked about the first two, both the diversity of different users and different psychologies, goals, and behaviors, and also the diversity of levels of search sophistication and domain knowledge. There's a couple of other points that I've listed here that I'm not going to cover, but I want you to have a taste that this is important in any search strategy, to look very closely at this context and try to capture at least different corners of the space. Once you've accounted for the users and the context involved, the next ingredient to look at is the content that you have. As I mentioned, all of these are interdependent, so the order is less important than the holistic approach. But when you're looking at the content, the first thing to look at is what content to bring in and what to crawl and index. The technology allows you to crawl everything. And as I mentioned, the number one issue in search relevancy is that you haven't crawled the stuff that you're looking for. But this is a trap. And it's a classic one when you take the technology first approach. If you look at how web search works, web search engines don't crawl everything. And that's a common misconception that Google gets everything on the web. But in fact, the web currently has well over 1 trillion unique pages before you even get into databases in what's called the deep web. And what's crawled is only a fraction of that. So the approach of crawling everything is not just expensive, time-consuming, and difficult in the enterprise. It's not a good practice because it brings in a lot of dreck along with the good content. One of the key techniques is to look at what's called an authoritative source. They're going to be a set of places, locations, systems, repositories that are better curated, that are known to be good content, and that are where you want to go for particular answers. If you go to Google, for example, we very often bring in Wikipedia results because Wikipedia is a general yet relatively authoritative source. And the same thing applies inside of your organization. As part of your planning, identifying what the authoritative sources are will be a really key thing. And you want to index those first. And in fact, bias them higher so that you crawl good content, that you serve up that content high in the results as relevant to a particular information need. There's much more to talk about when it comes to content indexing, security, but I wanted to give you a flavor of the highlights. Forget trying to search everything and trying to crawl everything. And the approach of looking at targeted, tailored applications will help you with this. And always think about authoritative sources. Also, because search is so fluid and so easy to change, don't be afraid of taking things a piece at a time. Adding in a new content source is easy. And unlike a database where a new source might change the schema, it's effectively schemaless. So you can work in a very agile way to bring in new content. Let's talk about a third ingredient, a metadata strategy. Metadata is literally data about data. They're making content findable, usable, and free. And when I talk about content needing to be free, I don't mean like free beer, because free beer tends to be bad in my experience, but you cannot predict where content is going to be used and how it's going to be used. And the more open you leave that, the better. The irony is that putting structure on that content really is what sets it free. The more metadata and the more quality metadata that you provide, the more uses that content is going to find. And the way that authors and content creators think about their content is often very different than how end users think about that content. So this metadata is key, and it shows up in the user experience very strongly in search, both as refiners, as findable and sortable elements, and as this kind of exploration and information about the content. Filtering down on it, etc. This is really important. The challenge is that most metadata sucks. And let me show you a quick illustration, if you will, a dream sequence about the potential of having good metadata.
I wish we could organize our information so that each of us could find precisely what we're looking for. Maybe if we had some extra staff to read through our content and tag it with all the ways we might want to find it, and file it by all the different tags. Of course, we're going to need to do this for all our content, and we're going to need a ton of taggers. I mean, we're going to need... forget it.
So that dream sequence shows how impossible it really is to create metadata by hand. But it's possible to create metadata by machine. And if you haven't already done this with SharePoint, it's a remarkable thing. It does require an add-on product. But you can, for example, look at content here in a document library. It has really no metadata, just the name, modified date, author. Authors are usually wrong, by the way. Annotate it in the library and end up with metadata that's populated according to taxonomies in the SharePoint term store. This is a great way to get the metadata that you need for search and other applications without the manual effort that really makes it impossible to do by hand. So if you do nothing else from this talk, be aware that you can do this and look at some options for adding into SharePoint the technology to do this text analytics, if you will. So I've talked about just a little bit of the elements in a metadata strategy, but you've seen how essential it is to have good metadata for findability and exploration, and the fact that you can make metadata by machine. There's much more to say about information architecture, metadata, etc. But let's move on to the next ingredient in a strategy, which is the user experience. Now, of course, all of the other elements play into a great user experience, but there are some aspects of fielding a remarkable user experience and an effective one that you should consider on their own merits. First of all, there are design patterns, and I'll credit Peter Morville's design patterns for this, that are common. You always think about the best first, top results in terms of a ranked list, but faceted navigation is an important design pattern that users are not used to and takes an amazing amount of the pressure off of having relevance ranking. There's also an autocomplete pattern, and these elements are built into SharePoint in order to provide positive search user experience. The trick is using them in the right place, fielding them, and putting them into the user experience in a way that meets the context. Refinement, for example, which is built in, is by default on the left of the page. But depending upon the experience and where you want people to focus, you might want it in different places. Here's just two examples from consumer search, which set the paradigm and the expectations of the end users, even though it's a different domain than enterprise search. Here's an example from a SharePoint deployment where the use of a hover panel for, in this case, taxonomy or hierarchical refinement is the right way to do it. Another pattern, which is called adaptive refinement, in which you uncover, based upon the context and the choices a user is making, the next set and the next set and the next set. The more metadata you have, the easier it is to field this, and it's a very powerful pattern. And shown on the right, an example from legal research SharePoint application in which a wide set of metadata is available. In this case, it collapsed. So only when you go into it and expand it do you see the refiners themselves. That lets you use a lot more of the screen real estate for visibility of what metadata is relevant at this step in the exploration. The other pattern is about converting search into action. Even though the search user experience and what you do as you're exploring, finding, and refinding information in all of the modalities we talked about earlier, that's really important. But if you take a step back, all of that is part of a larger process. You're finding things in order to write a report. You're finding things in order to answer a customer's question, or in order to stay aware of what your competitors are doing. And that's part of the context that we talked about. So once you know that context, you can feed the search results directly into whatever that process is. I'm showing something from a workspace that's not out of the box in SharePoint. It's an add-on capability, but it gives you the idea of taking a set of things you found, exporting them, or automatically converting them into a new document. And this makes it easy to carry the results of search sessions further into the process. So that's what I mean by converting search into action. You're familiar with this kind of paradigm through shopping cart or comparison search in a consumer experience. The screenshots I'm showing you here are fielded from SharePoint. This is a SharePoint 2013 system built along with add-on capabilities that are from my current company, BA Insight, in a beautiful, remarkable experience that gets people to their goal. Because search is not the goal, it's a means to achieve your goal. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about your user experience, coming back to the context, what's the goal, what are the elements that you want to bring in. And SharePoint is a great environment in which to do that because you can apply workflows, forms, and many other elements of SharePoint into these search-driven experiences. It highlights these modalities that we talked about in user context fit into exploration patterns that help you focus experiences. It's good practice to show things that fit the goals the users are after, and they're not all the same. That brings us back again to the practice of tailored, targeted search applications, because then you can do this quite clearly. Refinement and faceted navigation is now a well-accepted pattern, and adding graphical elements to that works very well. Organizing the content, and we didn't really talk about this, but metadata again helps it. Organizing it in a grouped manner makes it for a natural user experience, and converting search directly into action using that context is another really important element as you develop your approach for providing search user experiences. So if I recap, we've been talking about what does a search strategy look like? Both the approaches of using search as a platform, using departmental level search, etc., and then the key elements to consider as you're working out that strategy. The context, content, metadata, and user experience. And starting with the user is the number one takeaway. It's very easy to start with the content, especially if you're coming from an IT background, because that's concrete. You won't capture all of the user contexts. And that's why using an agile approach or an iterative approach is important. And you'll find that people rarely can tell you what they want in an experience. This is much more of a I'll know it when I see it kind of gestalt. So starting with wireframes for a user experience is often less effective than starting with a prototype and explorations and watching people work with it. Just a quick mention of where I'm coming from and what my company does. We focus entirely on search. So this search strategy approach, a lot of the elements that you need to create great search beyond what's out of the box in SharePoint 2013 are available from us as software packages in what we call a knowledge integration platform. It includes the kind of text analytics that makes metadata by machine, some pre-built user experience elements, as well as connectivity to over 50 different systems to make it possible to get at all of the important content, all of the authoritative content in one unified view. We also offer a SearchPoint strategy session, which goes much more in depth into the elements I've been talking about in this session. And if you're interested in this, just get in touch with us. To recap this session, we really started with an awareness of the trap many organizations find themselves in, and the paradox that despite great search capabilities, the majority of organizations are trapped in this search immaturity cycle. Partially through a lack of awareness of the depth behind search, because they have a mentality set by a consumer search experience which is very simple and hides an enormous amount of resources and complexity that sit beneath the water. We talked about 3 of the classic traps. trying to build your company's Google, deciding that you want one place, one search to rule them all, and treating search as an appliance you sort of just plug in and walk away from. If you find yourself in any of those traps, take a deep breath, then run away as quickly as you can. Go back to square one, look at what you're doing from a strategy standpoint, and keep in mind these traits that we talked about that lead to success, that we've distilled from experience with hundreds of organizations, as well as lots of feedback from analysts, researchers, and folks that have a lot of experience with search and SharePoint. Keep in mind that search is much more than the technology. It's a system that includes effectively all the people in your organization because everyone uses search. And almost everyone is creating content that feeds into this system. We touched on a recipe for success, starting with strategy. Really this strategy, people, objectives, technology, this SPOT approach. And we went through 4 of the key ingredients to a successful search strategy. So thank you very much for attending this session. I hope it's been both informative and useful. If you have questions, put them in the chat window. You can contact me at any time, jefffried@bainsight.com. And I wish you good luck and much success in your search journey. I want you to know that it's possible to field great search, that you already own the technology that requires, and looking at the strategy first will lead you away from the search and maturity cycle into a successful strategy. Thank you very much.